The fluorescent lights of the fourth-floor corridor hummed with an aggressive, insect-like buzz that seemed to burrow directly into Layla's skull. She adjusted the collar of her dark green scrubs, the fabric feeling rough against her damp skin. It was 3 in the morning, the graveyard shift, usually a time when the hospital settled into a rhythmic, peaceful slumber of beeping monitors and soft footsteps. But tonight, the air tasted like copper and ozone. Tonight, the entire East Wing had been locked down. Shadows stretched long and unnatural across the linoleum floor, cast by men who did not belong in a place of healing. They stood like statues at every exit, wearing suits that cost more than Layla's annual salary, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses even in the dim, artificial light. They were silent sentinels, their hands clasped in front of them, barely concealing the heavy, angular bulges of firearms beneath their tailored jackets. Layla clutched the metal clipboard against her chest like a shield, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had been specifically requested for this room. Not because she was the most senior nurse, she was only 23, but because the head charge nurse had suddenly come down with a convenient illness the moment the black SUVs pulled up to the emergency entrance. Layla forced her breathing to steady, counting the tiles as she walked toward room 404. Every instinct she possessed, honed by a childhood spent navigating spaces where she wasn't welcome, screamed at her to turn around and run. But running drew attention, and attention was the one thing she could not afford. She was supposed to be invisible. Just a pair of hands to change for bags and check vitals. Just a nameless face in green scrubs. She reached the heavy oak door of the VIP suite. 2 men stood guard here, larger than the others, their presence radiating a cold, professional menace. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, held up a hand to stop her.
He didn't speak.
He simply looked her up and down, his gaze stripping away her professional demeanor to assess her as a potential threat. Layla didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that fear was a scent, and predators could smell it from a mile away. She held up her ID badge, her hand rock steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. The guard stared at her face, then the badge, before giving a microscopic nod. He stepped aside, and the other guard opened the door. The rush of cold, conditioned air that hit her face felt like walking into a tomb. Inside the suite, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The room was spacious, more like a hotel suite than a hospital room, with plush leather chairs and a view of the city skyline. But the luxury was marred by the forest of medical equipment surrounding the bed in the center. In that bed lay an old man, frail and withered, his skin the color of parchment. This was Chairman Park. The name alone was enough to make the hospital administrators sweat through their shirts. He was a legend, a ghost story whispered in the back alleys of the city, the patriarch of an empire built on blood and silence. But right now, he was just a dying man hooked up to a ventilator. Layla moved toward the bed, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the carpet. She checked the monitors. His heart rate was thready, his blood pressure dangerously low. She began her work, her movements precise and efficient. She adjusted the drip, checked the catheter, and gently smoothed the sheets. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear the door open again. She only felt the change in the room's pressure, a sudden heaviness that made the air hard to breathe. She turned slowly. Standing at the foot of the bed was a man who looked like a sleek, dangerous weapon sheathed in silk. Kong Dae did not look like a man visiting his sick father. He looked like a king surveying a crumbling kingdom. He was tall, with sharp, angular features that seemed carved from ice. His suit was midnight blue, immaculate, without a single crease. He watched Layla with eyes that were devoid of warmth, calculating, assessing. Beside him stood another man, slightly younger, with a restless energy, June, the enforcer. June's hand hovered near his waist, his eyes darting around the room, checking corners, checking windows. Layla felt like a rabbit trapped between 2 wolves. She averted her gaze, focusing on the chairman's foreline, trying to make herself small. His vitals are stable, but weak, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She kept her tone professional, detached. He needs rest. The stress. It isn't good for his heart. Kong Dae didn't answer immediately. He walked to the side of the bed, looking down at his father with an expression that hovered somewhere between contempt and grief. "Leave us," he said. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of a gavel striking a sounding block. It wasn't a request. Layla nodded quickly, eager to escape the suffocating orbit of his gravity. She moved toward the door, her head down. Just as her hand touched the handle, a groan echoed from the bed. It was a guttural, wet sound, filled with pain. Layla froze. Her duty as a nurse warred with her survival instinct. The groan came again, louder this time. The monitors began to beep rapidly. The chairman was thrashing, his hands clawing weakly at the sheets. Kongdae stiffened, taking a step back, looking unsure for the first time. He wasn't a healer. He was a destroyer. He didn't know what to do. Layla turned back. She saw the panic rising in the old man's eyes, the way he gasped for air, fighting the ventilator. He was terrified. In that moment, the dangerous men in the room faded into the background. There was only the patient. Layla rushed back to the bedside. "Hold his hands," she ordered, her voice sharp and authoritative. Kongdae looked at her, surprised by the sudden change in her tone, but he didn't move. "I said hold his hands. He's pulling out the line." Layla snapped, reaching out to secure the chairman's wrist. The old man was delirious, his eyes rolling back, shouting something unintelligible, lost in a fevered dream of his past. The chairman's thrashing became violent. He was shouting now, words spilling out in a feverish torrent. Layla recognized the tone before she recognized the words. It was the sound of desperation, of a man lost in a time and place that no longer existed. He wasn't speaking the polished, standard language of the capital. He was speaking the rough, clipped dialect of the southern docks, the language of fishermen and smugglers, of hard labor and salty air. It was a dialect that marked you, a way of speaking that the elite looked down upon. Layla's heart stopped. She knew this tongue. She knew the cadence, the specific slang, the way the vowels were swallowed and the consonants hit hard. It was the language of her childhood home, a place she had fled, a place she had buried deep inside her. The chairman was crying out for water, but using a specific, archaic term used only by the old dock workers of Busan. Kongdae looked at his father, his face a mask of confusion and frustration. He understood the language, of course, but he couldn't calm him. The connection was broken. The old man was flailing, his heart rate spiking to critical levels. If he didn't calm down, he would code. Layla didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk. She simply reacted. She leaned in close to the chairman's ear, her hand gently cupping his face, her thumb stroking his cheekbone. And then she spoke. She didn't speak in English. She didn't speak in the polite, standard tongue taught in textbooks. She spoke in the thick, gritty, unmistakable dialect of the Busan docks. "Hush now, old uncle," she murmured, the sounds rolling off her tongue with a natural, practiced ease that shocked even her. "The waves are calm tonight. The nets are full. Rest your head. The water is coming." Her voice was low, guttural, perfectly mimicking the intonation of a native born and raised in the salt spray. It was a sound that didn't match her face, didn't match her skin, didn't match the setting. It was a ghost sound. The effect was instantaneous. The chairman froze. His eyes focused, locking onto hers. He heard the sound of home. He heard the sound of his youth. His breathing hitched, then slowed. The frantic beeping of the monitor decelerated into a steady rhythm. He gripped Layla's hand, his fingers surprisingly strong, and whispered a name from the past, before his eyes fluttered shut and he drifted into a peaceful sleep. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the silence of the grave. Layla slowly straightened up, her hand slipping from the old man's grip. The reality of what she had just done crashed down on her. She felt the blood drain from her face. She turned slowly to face the room. June, the enforcer, had his hand on his weapon, his mouth slightly open, staring at her as if she had just grown wings. But it was Kongdae who terrified her. He was staring at her with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. The mask of indifference was gone. In its place was a sharp, predatory curiosity. He looked at this young black woman in green scrubs, this stranger in his father's room, and he tried to reconcile what he saw with what he had just heard. A dialect that specific, that authentic, couldn't be learned in a classroom. It had to be lived. It had to be bled. He took a slow step toward her. The air in the room crackled with static. Layla backed away until her legs hit the side of the bed. There was nowhere to run. "Who are you?"
Kongdae asked.
His voice was quiet, but it vibrated with a dangerous undercurrent. He didn't wait for an answer. He closed the distance between them, invading her personal space, his height looming over her. "That dialect," he continued, his eyes searching hers for a lie. "That is not something a tourist picks up. That is the language of the gutter. The language of my father's generation. The language of the wharf rats." He spat the name like a curse, yet there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Recognition? Suspicion? Layla swallowed hard, her throat dry. I studied languages," she stammered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "I have an ear for accents. It was a weak defense, and they both knew it." Kongdae laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Studied," he mocked. "You don't study the soul of a place. You spoke to him like family. You spoke to him like you stood on those docks." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his palm. June stepped forward, his professional paranoia kicking in. "Boss," he said, his voice tense.
"This isn't right. She's a plant. A spy."
"No one speaks like that unless they were there. We need to take her downstairs." The threat was explicit. Downstairs meant a room with no cameras and a drain in the floor. Layla's hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists to hide the shaking. She had to stay calm. If she broke now, she was dead. "I am a nurse," she said, forcing her voice to be firm, channeling the steel she had forged during years of hiding. "I did what was necessary to save your father." He was coding. I calmed him. "If you want to kill the person who just saved his life, go ahead. But do it outside so you don't wake him up again." It was a gamble. A massive, reckless gamble. She met Kongdae's gaze, refusing to look away. For a second, she saw a flash of respect in his eyes. He appreciated strength. He appreciated defiance. He lowered his hand, stepping back slightly, giving her room to breathe. "You have spirit," he murmured. He circled Layla like a shark investigating a disturbance in the water, his movements fluid and predatory. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the heavy, suffocating weight of unasked questions. He stopped behind her, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of expensive tobacco and sandalwood clinging to his suit, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic sterility of the hospital room. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in her chest. "You say you are a nurse," he began, the words slow and deliberate, "but nurses do not stand so still when threatened. Nurses do not look a man like June in the eye without flinching. And nurses certainly do not speak the dialect of the southern wharfs with the inflection of a native daughter." Layla kept her eyes fixed on the chairman's rising and falling chest, using the rhythm of his breathing to anchor herself. She knew that any sudden movement would be interpreted as aggression. Her mind raced, cataloging her options, which were dwindling by the second. She was trapped in a high-rise glass box with men who solved problems by burying them. "My history is not relevant to his care," she replied, her voice steady but lacking the defiance she had shown earlier. It was a calculated retreat, a softening of her posture to appear less threatening. "What matters is that he is stable. The stress of an interrogation will spike his cortisol levels. If you want him to live, you need to let me work." Kongdae walked back into her line of sight, his expression unreadable. He reached out and plucked the ID badge from her scrubs, reading the name printed there. "Layla," he read aloud, testing the sound of it. "A name that tells me nothing. No family name. No history." He tossed the badge back against her chest. "My father's enemies are numerous, Layla. They are creative. They send women with poison in their rings, or men with knives in their sleeves. And now, perhaps, they send a nurse who speaks the language of his heart to lower his guard." June shifted by the door, his hand tightening on the grip of his weapon, waiting for the signal to strike. Layla felt the cold sweat trickling down her spine.
She had to give them something.
A truth that was also a lie. "I was not sent by your enemies," she said, turning to face Kongdae fully. "I grew up in a port city. Not here. But the people who raised me, they were from your south. Refugees. Exiles. They spoke that way when they thought no one was listening. I learned it before I learned English. It is the language of my childhood, not a weapon. It was a dangerous fabrication, stitching together pieces of her actual fractured past with a narrative that might satisfy his paranoia. Kangdae studied her face, searching for the micro-expressions of a liar. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw a strange, haunting authenticity. He saw a woman who understood what it meant to be displaced. The air in the room shifted again, but this time it wasn't due to the conversation. Layla felt it first, a subtle vibration in the floorboards, a change in the ambient hum of the building. Her survival instincts, dormant but never gone, flared to life. She looked up at the vent in the ceiling. The airflow had stopped. "Quiet," she hissed, cutting off Kangdae just as he opened his mouth to speak. The command was so sharp, so absolute, that both men froze. "The ventilation," she whispered, pointing up. "It just cut out." And the hallway. The buzzing stopped. Kangdae's eyes narrowed. He looked at June, who was already moving toward the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The heavy silence of the hospital corridor was wrong. It was too quiet. No squeak of rubber shoes, no distant paging system, no rattle of carts. It was the silence of a held breath. June pulled back from the door as if burned, drawing his weapon in a blur of motion. "Breach," he mouthed, the single word hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. Layla didn't wait for instructions. She dropped the clipboard and moved to the chairman's bed, unlocking the wheels with a swift kick of her heel. "We have to move him," she said, her voice dropping the nurse persona entirely, replaced by the cold, clipped tone of someone used to navigating war zones. "This room is a kill box. Too many windows. One exit." Kangdae looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time seeing not the nurse, but the soldier beneath the scrubs. The first shot didn't sound like a gunshot. It sounded like a heavy book being dropped flat on a table. The suppression was high grade. The bullet shattered the lock of the suite's door, sending splinters of wood and brass spraying across the room. June fired back blindly through the wood, 3 rapid shots that deafened them in the enclosed space. "Get down," Kangdae roared, diving toward the bed to shield his father. But Layla was already moving. She wasn't cowering. She was grabbing the portable oxygen tank and the emergency medical bag, slinging them over her shoulder. The glass of the large window overlooking the city spiderwebbed as a second team rappelled from the roof, swinging in with submachine guns. It was a coordinated hit, a pincer movement.
They were coming from the hall and the sky.
Layla threw herself flat against the floor, dragging the 4 stand down with her so the lines wouldn't rip out of the chairman's arm. Glass rained down like diamonds, sharp and deadly. The room erupted into chaos. The roar of automatic fire filled the space, chewing up the expensive leather furniture and shattering the vases of flowers. Layla crawled through the debris, her knees sliding over glass shards, focused entirely on the old man. He was waking up, his eyes wide with terror, the monitor screaming an alarm that was lost in the cacophony of violence. Kangdae was returning fire at the window, his pistol booming like a cannon compared to the suppressed weapons of the assassins. He was a marksman, calm in the center of the storm. He took down the first repeller before the man's boots touched the carpet. The second attacker swung wide, spraying the room. Bullets stitched a line across the bedsheets, missing the chairman by inches. The bathroom. Layla screamed over the noise. "The walls are reinforced concrete. Move him." It was a desperate plan, but the only one they had. The main room was being shredded. June kicked the suite door open, firing into the hallway to clear a path, but was forced back by a hail of bullets. They were pinned. The bathroom was the only cover. Kangdae grabbed the head of the bed, and Layla grabbed the foot. Together, they shoved the heavy hospital bed across the debris-strewn floor. The wheels caught on the thick carpet and shattered glass. Layla put her shoulder into the frame, driving with her legs, her muscles burning. A bullet grazed her arm, a hot sting that she ignored. They slammed the bed through the wide bathroom doorway just as a grenade rolled into the main suite. "Cover!" June yelled, diving in after them and slamming the heavy door. The explosion rocked the foundation of the building, blowing out the remaining windows and plunging the suite into darkness and smoke. Inside the bathroom, The air was thick with dust and the smell of cordite. The emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a sickly green wash. The chairman was gasping, clutching his chest. Layla was instantly on him, her hands moving with a speed that blurred. She checked his pulse, checked the lines. "He's going into shock," she announced, her voice calm despite the ringing in her ears. She ripped open the emergency bag. "I need light." Real light. Kongdae pulled a tactical flashlight from his belt and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dust. He shone it on his father, then on Layla. He saw the blood soaking the sleeve of her scrubs. "You're hit," he said, the observation flat, factual. Layla didn't even look at her arm. "It's a scratch." "Hold the light steady." She injected a sedative into the chairman's foreport. "We can't stay here," June growled, reloading his weapon. "They'll breach this door in 2 minutes." "We're sitting ducks." Layla looked around the bathroom. It was luxurious, massive, with a marble tub and a separate shower. And she noticed a laundry chute. It was small, designed for towels, but it led down. "The laundry chute," she said, pointing to the brass door in the wall. "It drops to the basement laundry." "It's a straight shot." June looked at the small opening and shook his head. "The chairman won't fit." "I won't fit." Layla looked at Kongdae. "You won't," she agreed. "But I can go down. I can clear the basement. If I can get to the service elevator, I can bring it up to this floor." The service elevator opens from the inside. They won't be watching it. It was suicide. It was insanity. And it was their only chance. Kongdae looked at her, his eyes hard. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "You could wait here. You could surrender. They don't want you. They want him." Layla paused, her hand on the latch of the chute. Why indeed? She could claim it was duty, but that was a lie. It was the adrenaline. It was the old instinct of the hunted refusing to be caught. And perhaps it was the fact that for the first time in years, she felt useful. Not just a pair of hands, but a force. "Because if they come through that door, they kill everyone," she said simply. "And I don't plan on dying tonight." She didn't wait for permission. She opened the chute, the smell of bleach and damp linen wafting up. "Give me a weapon," she said, extending her hand to June. The enforcer hesitated, looking at his boss. Kongdae nodded. June pulled a backup pistol from his ankle holster and handed it to her. Layla checked the chamber, verified the safety was off, and gripped it with a familiarity that made June's eyebrows raise. She didn't hold it like a prop. She held it like an extension of her hand. She slid into the metal darkness of the chute, bracing her legs against the sides to control her descent. It was a terrifying slide, spiraling down through the guts of the hospital. She landed in a pile of heavy canvas laundry carts in the basement, the impact jarring her teeth. She rolled out, gun raised, scanning the room. The basement was a labyrinth of steam pipes and humming machinery. It was loud here, the industrial washers drowning out any subtle sounds. She moved through the shadows, her green scrubs blending with the dim utility lighting. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She was a ghost in the machine. She reached the service elevator, but a guard was there, one of the attackers, speaking into a radio. He was turning toward her. Layla didn't hesitate. She didn't shout a warning. She fired twice, center mass, the recoil familiar and jarring. The man dropped. She rushed to his body, taking his radio and his keycard. She swiped the card, summoning the elevator. As the doors groaned open, she keyed the radio. "Basement clear," she said into the mic, mimicking the dead man's gruff voice as best she could. Heading up to secure the package, she stepped into the elevator, the metal box rising slowly, carrying her back into the fire. She checked her reflection in the polished steel doors. Blood on her face, ash in her hair, a gun in her hand. The disguise was gone. The real Layla had finally stepped into the light. The service elevator dinged softly as it arrived on the 4th floor, the sound incongruously cheerful amidst the carnage. Layla didn't step out immediately. She used the polished metal of the doorframe as a mirror to check the hallway. Smoke billowed from the VIP suite, obscuring the far end of the corridor where the main firefight had taken place. Bodies lay on the floor, hospital security, the chairman's guards, and the attackers in tactical gear. It was a slaughterhouse. Layla moved low, keeping tight to the wall, her breathing controlled. She reached the bathroom door from the outside. It was battered, dented from the inside where the attackers had tried to ram it, but it held. She knocked a specific rhythm. 3 fast, 1 slow. The knock on the bathroom door was a precise, rhythmic code that cut through the haze of adrenaline and fear inside the cramped sanctuary. Inside, June tensed, his weapon raised toward the dented metal, his finger whitening on the trigger. Kangdae stood over his father, shielding the old man's body with his own, his eyes fixed on the entrance. "It's the signal," Kangdae whispered, though he didn't lower his guard. He nodded once to June. The enforcer reached out and threw the bolt, kicking the door open while simultaneously dropping to a knee to fire if necessary. But the hallway was empty of enemies, save for the bodies on the floor and the swirling smoke. Standing there, framed by the carnage, was Layla. She looked different. The shy nurse who had checked vitals an hour ago was gone. In her place stood a woman covered in soot and drywall dust, a pistol held loosely at her side, her eyes scanning the corridor with a predator's awareness. "Elevator is secure," she said, her voice flat and devoid of panic. "We have 90 seconds before the backup generator kicks the main security grid back online and locks down the shafts. We move now." They moved with the desperate coordination of a unit under fire. June grabbed the front of the wheelchair they had managed to transfer the chairman into, while Kangdae took the back. Layla took point, stepping over the shattered glass and spent shell casings, her weapon raised. The hallway was a nightmare landscape of flickering emergency strobes and the hiss of broken steam pipes. As they neared the service elevator, a door to the left burst open. A straggler from the hit squad, bloodied but still dangerous, stumbled out, raising a submachine gun. June's hands were full with the chair. Kangdae was blocked by the bulk of the equipment. Layla didn't flinch. She pivoted on her heel, dropping her center of gravity, and fired 2 controlled shots. The attacker crumpled against the doorframe, sliding down in a smear of red. She didn't pause to check the body. She kept moving, sweeping the elevator car as the doors slid open. "In," she commanded. "Get him against the back wall." The doors groaned shut, sealing them in the steel box just as the sound of shouting erupted from the stairwell they had left behind. The descent was agonizingly slow. The smell of burnt gunpowder and copper filled the small space. Kangdae looked at Layla, really looked at her, seeing the way her hands didn't shake, the way she checked the ammunition count in the magazine with a glance. "You never told me your last name," he said, the question cutting through the mechanical hum of the elevator. Layla didn't look at him. She watched the floor numbers tick down. "I didn't think it mattered," she replied softly. "In this city, names are just targets." The basement loading dock was a cavernous, concrete expanse filled with the smell of diesel and rotting garbage. The service elevator opened, and Layla surged out first, clearing the corners. The space was empty, save for a black, armored van idling near the ramp, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The driver, a man with a shaved head and a terrified expression, looked up as they emerged. He had clearly been waiting for a signal that almost didn't come. "Open the back."
Junrot, abandoningstæller for speed.
They rushed the chairman toward the vehicle. Layla stayed behind them, walking backward, her eyes scanning the catwalks above. She knew how these things worked. There was always a second wave. As they loaded the chairman into the back of the van, a single shot rang out from the darkness of the upper levels, sparking off the pavement inches from Layla's foot. She didn't scramble. She raised her weapon, aiming at the muzzle flash in the rafters, and fired a suppression volley that sent the sniper ducking for cover. "Go!" she screamed, diving into the back of the van just as the tires screeched against the concrete. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing them in darkness, and the vehicle roared up the ramp, bursting out into the rainy city night. The interior of the van was a mobile command center lined with screens and communication equipment, but right now it served as a trauma unit. The vehicle swerved violently through traffic, the suspension groaning under the aggressive maneuvers of the driver. Layla was thrown against the metal wall but immediately scrambled to her knees, moving toward the chairman. He was conscious but pale, his breathing shallow. "I need the medkit," she barked at June, who was busy stripping off his tactical vest. He handed her a hardshell case from under the bench seat. Layla cracked it open, her fingers flying over the supplies. She hooked the chairman up to a portable monitor, the rhythmic beeping filling the tense silence of the cabin. She worked with a focus that excluded everything else, the swaying of the van, the wail of distant sirens, and the intense scrutiny of the two dangerous men watching her every move. She flushed his foreline, administered a stabilizer, and checked his pupils. His heart rate is stabilizing, she announced after a tense minute. He's tough. The shock didn't kill him. She sat back on her heels, wiping a smudge of blood from her cheek with the back of her hand. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping exhaustion. Kangdae sat opposite her, his suit ruined, his face smeared with dust. He held a bottle of water, but he hadn't opened it. He was watching Layla with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. You cleared a jam in that pistol back in the hallway, he observed quietly. Muscle memory. You didn't even look at it. And your stance. That's not self-defense class training. That's military. Or worse, Layla looked down at her hands, which were now resting in her lap, stained with the chairman's blood and the grime of the hospital floor. The lie she had told earlier, about learning the dialect from refugees, wouldn't hold up against the physical evidence of the last hour. She had exposed herself. I was a medic, she said, her voice low, the truth slipping out because she was too tired to hold it back. Before I came here, before I tried to disappear, I worked in conflict zones where the only law was who had the bigger gun. I learned to stitch wounds in the back of trucks while being shot at. I learned to shoot back because sometimes the red cross on your arm is just a target. It wasn't the whole truth. She left out the parts about who she had worked for and why she had fled, but it was enough. The chairman stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around the dim interior of the van, confused, until his gaze landed on Layla. A faint smile touched his withered lips. He reached out a trembling hand, and Layla took it without hesitation. He spoke again, his voice a rasping whisper, using that same rough, coastal dialect that had started this entire cascade of events. The storm is passing, daughter, he said. You steered the boat well. Layla felt a lump form in her throat. She answered him in kind, the harsh, guttural sounds of the Busan docks rolling off her tongue with a tenderness that belied their roughness. Rest now, uncle. The harbor is in sight. No more waves tonight. Kangdae watched the exchange, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before hardening back into the mask of the boss. He realized then that he couldn't let her go. She knew too much. She had seen the weakness of the organization, the breach in their security. But more than that, she was an asset of terrifying value. A healer who could kill. A stranger who spoke the language of his father's soul. You know you can't go back to the hospital, Kangdae said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's sentence. Layla, the nurse died tonight in that hallway. If you return to your apartment, my enemies will find you. If the police find you, they will ask questions you cannot answer. The van slowed, turning off the asphalt onto a gravel road. The sound of the tires changed to a rhythmic crunching. They had arrived. Layla looked out the small, bulletproof window. They were deep in the countryside, approaching a massive, gated estate that looked more like a fortress than a home. Floodlights swept the perimeter, and armed guards patrolled the walls. This was the inner sanctum, the heart of the empire. The van stopped, and the back doors were pulled open by guards who looked even more professional and terrifying than the ones at the hospital. Fresh air, smelling of pine and rain, flooded the cabin. June hopped out first, helping the guards unload the chairman onto a waiting gurney. The medical team of the estate took over, rushing the old man toward the main house. Layla remained in the van for a moment, sitting in the darkness, the weight of her reality settling on her shoulders. She had survived the night, but she had lost her freedom. She had traded a life of hiding in plain sight for a life inside a gilded cage. Kangdae stood at the back of the van, extending a hand to help her down. It was a gentlemanly gesture, but the context made it a command. Layla looked at his hand, then up at his face. The curiosity was gone from his eyes, replaced by a possessive determination. He had claimed her. She took his hand and stepped down onto the gravel. Where do I go? She asked, her voice steady. She wasn't asking for directions to a room. She was asking for her place in this new world. Kangdae didn't let go of her hand immediately. He gestured toward the massive house, glowing warm and inviting against the dark sky. "You are not a guest," he said. "And you are not a prisoner.
You are family now.
My father owes you his life.
I owe you mine."
That is a debt that is not paid with money." He began walking toward the house, expecting her to follow. Layla stood still for a heartbeat, looking back at the dark road that led to the city, to her small apartment, to the plants she needed to water, to the life she had carefully constructed. It was gone. All of it. She turned and followed Kangdae. As they walked through the massive double doors of the estate, June fell into step behind her, no longer watching her with suspicion, but with the respectful distance one accords to a fellow soldier. They entered a grand foyer, marble floors reflecting the light of a crystal chandelier. Kangdae stopped and turned to her. "Tomorrow, we will discuss your new role," he said. "You have talents that are wasted changing bedpans. We have need of someone who can navigate the storms." He used the metaphor she had used with his father, a subtle acknowledgement of her power. Layla looked down at her green scrubs, stained and torn. She felt the weight of the pistol still tucked into her waistband, a cold, hard reminder of who she really was. She looked up at Kangdae, her chin lifting in a gesture of acceptance that was also a challenge. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had burned away in the fire of the night. "If I stay," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the large hall, "I don't wear the scrubs. And I don't take orders from your foot soldiers. If I'm family, I stand at the table, not serve it." Kangdae's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. He recognized the steel in her. It was the same steel that ran through his own veins. "Agreed," he said. "Welcome home, Layla."